1994, under the Clinton administration, when Don't Ask, Don't Tell was installed. I was critical of it. I didn't think it'd work. And now that time has gone by and we've gone, what, 16 or 17 years, it's something that has, there's an old saying now that I recall that I've used in the past, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. It has worked. I really believe it has worked. And let me just get into it, just ask the same question that Senator McCain asked in perhaps a little different way. Right now, we have the best, probably the best retention and recruitment percentages, over 100% everywhere except, I think, just the Army Guard. And there are some other reasons for that. And this is something that has concerned me as to how this would affect that. When you look at the report under question 71B, and you take the positive and the very positive, the negative and very negatives, and the question is, would it affect your immediate unit effectiveness at completing its mission? It's 2.5 to 1. 2.5 to 1 that they're stating that this would have a negative effect. Then when you look at the other figures, you have to ask the question, how is this going to negatively impact the recruitment or retention? And I think that there's another figure that can be used. The 23.7% would either leave or think about leaving, Admiral Mullen, the service. This is from the report. And also 7% of the military members surveyed said that repeal would not be willing to recommend military service to someone else. Now, I know there have been studies made. As I recall, it's about 50% of the people who go into the military do so at the recommendation of someone who's already in. Let's assume that that's right. Are you concerned at all about what's going to happen to our retention and recruitment, Admiral Mullen?
Senator, the report properly flagged these issues, and I think that's important. So it's certainly something, if implemented, we've got to focus on. I've not met a soldier, sailor, airman, Marine, Coast Guardsman in my whole life, man or woman, who didn't think at one point or another about whether they were going to stay or go. And then, from my point of view, that focuses on exposure and understanding, and the survey or the report, which indicates how many, once exposed, it did not affect at the 90% level, including the combat arms, the Marines as well, that it did not affect unit readiness. Now, that's the reality of exposure. And there are clearly those, as Secretary of Defense said, who have not been exposed.
Okay, I understand your question, but it's taking up all my time, or your answer. Let me ask you this one further question. Do you believe that, well, why do you think only 2/3 of the people responded to this survey?
Actually, by every indication, and you'd have to get somebody that does this for a living, that it was an extraordinarily positive response when you talk about 28% of the 400,000 surveys that were sent out to the men and women in uniform, and the 150,000 to our families. More than statistically significant in all the key categories.
Well, I certainly disagree with that, and I have talked to people in the field who have said that we didn't respond because the decision was already made. I think Senator McCain already covered that, so I won't repeat that. Let me real quickly get this in, because I know tomorrow is the hearing where we'll have the service chiefs, but I think it's important to get it in the record here. General Swartz of the Air Force, I believe it is important, a matter of keeping faith with those currently serving in the armed forces, that the Secretary of Defense Commission review be completed before there is any legislation to repeal. Obviously, that didn't happen because legislation came through in the form of an amendment back on March 27th. Admiral Roughhead, we need to, my concern is that legislative changes at this point leading sailors to question whether their input matters. That's what I've heard in the field. It doesn't really matter. Why respond to it? General Casey, I remain convinced that it is critically important to get a better understanding of where our soldiers and families are on the issue. I also believe that repealing the law before the completion of the review will be seen by men and women of the Army as a reversal of our commitment to hear their views moving forward. Clearly, they believed last January that before any decision was made, we would hear their reviews. Then halfway through this, the legislation and the amendments came, I might say, right down party lines to go ahead and do that. And this is what we hear in the field. General Amos of the Marine Corps. Now is the wrong time to overturn Don't Ask, Don't Tell. As U.S. troops remain in the thick of war in Afghanistan, there's risk involved. I'm trying to determine how to measure that risk. This is not a social thing. This is a combat effectiveness that it's what the country pays Marines to do. Now, I know they're coming up tomorrow. We'll have a chance to ask them. Let me just ask you for a brief answer. Do you think that they're right or wrong?
I think there's an opportunity to hear them before legislation passes, as they have asked in the past.
Secretary Gates?
Well, I would just say there was another person that said something along those lines in terms of the review, and that was me before this committee in February when I urged that there be no legislation until the review had been completed.
All right. Now, lastly, I've heard several times that that's all right. Whatever happens here now is not all that significant because there is a final step. And the final step is that the repeal provision contained within both the House and the Representatives and the Senate, the Armed Services Committee, versions of NDAA would work as follows. Once the law is enacted, repealed, and so forth, and the President and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs and the Secretary deliver to Congress their recommendation based on these assumptions that come out of this report, and that isn't going to happen until that takes place. And yet, halfway through this process, Secretary Gates and Chairman Mullen, and of course the President has made it very clear, you've already made up your mind. So have you already made up your mind so that this step is not going to be necessary?
Absolutely not. The certification process, I think, is a critical piece of the legislation. And speaking for myself, I would not sign any certification until I was satisfied, with the advice of the service chiefs, that we had, in fact, mitigated, if not eliminated, to the extent possible, risks to combat readiness, to unit cohesion and effectiveness.
Even though you stated, I fully support the President's decision, the question before us is not whether the military prepares to make the change, but how we prepare for it.
That's exactly right.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Senator Inhofe. And now, Senator Reid.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Admiral Mullen has been, I think, a